Good evening, everyone. This is Vibhana Sheen, and I'm here to do a reading from the book Messages from the Masters by Dr. Brian Weiss. Today, we're going to do reading from chapter 12, remaining part of chapter 12, and we'll begin with chapter 13. We read about the different ways the psychics and the spiritual message holders convey their messages to us, but how we should remain alert and vigilant of the messages that's being conveyed to us. We are continuing from where we left. There are many ways to increase your own psychic sensitivities. Listen to and trust your intuitions. Observe how often you are correct. For example, when the phone rings, guess who is calling. The first name or thought that pops into your awareness is often the most accurate. Practice similar intuitional games whenever you have the opportunity. Like, what color will your friend be wearing when you meet later? Many of the exercises you will find later in this book, such as psychometry, faces, energy scanning, and visualization, will also allow you to go further practice and refine your own psychic and intuitive abilities. Mediumistic skills also may emerge when you work with these exercises. The two longer meditations in Appendix B will provide powerful practice as well. The art of meditation is also discussed in more detail later. The regular practice of meditation or related introspective techniques also opens psychic channels and allows you to experience the psycho-spiritual world directly. Your intention to open yourself to psychic and mediumistic experiences is also important. Before going to sleep, instruct yourself to be receptive to psychic dreams and messages. Ask for them to occur and remember to journal your experiences upon awakening. Even the growing awareness that your real nature is spiritual will increase the likelihood of having mystical and psychic experiences. Your mind will become more comfortable and familiar with such phenomena, encouraging even more events to happen. As the writer Wayne Dyer has said, you will see it when you believe it. A patient of mine was grieving deeply over the death of her son. He had died in 1994 at the age of 13. His death was sudden and unexpected due to an undiagnosed enlargement of his heart. His sister was with him when he died. The family started to see me to help cope with their tragedy. Now, 2 years later, the mother came to the office with her husband, her 12-year-old daughter, and her infant daughter, who was hungry and fidgeting. She went off with the baby to breastfeed while the other two waited with me in my office. We began talking about driving, and the father suddenly looked very sad. "What is wrong?" I asked. My son would have been 15 now. I would be teaching him to drive if he were alive. I've always looked forward to driving with him, and now I will never have the opportunity," he said quietly. We discussed his sadness for a while and then moved on to the other subjects. When mother and baby returned, I began a guided imagery exercise with the mother and older daughter. Father was walking the baby to sleep in the back of my office. I instructed the two participants to visualize a beautiful treasure chest, to fill this chest with those things they really need in their lives. Quietly, the mother began to weep. Later on, I asked her what she had experienced. "I saw my son," she replied, "and he was very vivid and real to me. I started to put him into the treasure chest, and then he spoke to me. 'You don't have to put me into that treasure chest,' he said, 'but I want you with me all the time.' She had answered, 'I am with you all the time. I love you all. Tell Daddy he's right. I love to drive with him, especially when he is by himself.' She had not known about her husband's sadness and regret or our earlier conversation. Her powerful vision and conversation with her son helped her greatly in beginning to heal her grief. This was her own experience, and she received immediate validation from her husband and older daughter. She had made a contact with her son. She felt that she had indeed talked to him. Her family bonded around this direct experience with him. They still grieved, but their recovery had started. We are all spiritual beings. We are all capable of having direct psychic and mediumistic experiences, just as this grieving mother did with her son. Yet, for the majority of us, it is easier to receive such messages from the other side in a slightly more indirect way, from the gifted medium whose heart is in the right place. The impact of these messages from our deceased loved ones can still be extremely powerful and life transforming. Chapter 13 Extraordinary Messages. It is on this plane that some souls are allowed to manifest themselves to the people who are still in the physical form. They are allowed to come back. On this plane, intercommunication is allowed. This is where you are allowed to use your psychic abilities and communicate with people in physical form. There are many ways to do this. Some are allowed the power of sight and can show themselves to the people still in physical form. Others have the power of movement and are allowed to move objects telepathically. Many people choose to come here because they are allowed to see those who are still in physical form and very close to them. The gifted psychic and medium Shar gave a reading to my teenage daughter Amy. The day before, Carol and I had attended the funeral of the grandfather of Amy's good friend David. Amy knew this man as Buzzy, his nickname. "I have a message for someone named David," Char told her. "It's from his grandfather, whose name is Howard or Harold." She went on with uncanny accuracy. Amy had never known that Buzzy's name was Howard. "Tell them that he loves them and he's fine. He is with Max and Sam." None of us knew Max or Sam. The next day, we learned that Sam was Buzzy's father, and Max was Sam's good friend and business partner for 25 years. We do not die when our physical bodies die. A part of us goes on: spirit, soul, consciousness. It is like walking through a door into another room, a larger, brighter, wonderful room. This is why we should not be afraid. We are always surrounded by love. Our loved ones never leave. We are all beautiful and immortal souls. We are in our bodies for a while, but we are not our bodies. When my patients and others receive messages from loved ones who have died, the messages are amazingly similar. Whether in regression, in dreams, from mediums, or in any other way, there is a common theme. I love you. I'm fine. Take care of yourself. Do not grieve so much for me. They are always telling us not to mourn. They know something we have forgotten. They are immortal, and so are we. One of the most powerful experiences of my life occurred when I received an extraordinary message during a regression with Catherine. I share this story so you may understand a moment that forever changed my life. The greatest tragedy in my life had been the unexpected death of our firstborn son, Adam, who was only 23 days old when he died early in 1971. About 10 days after we had brought him home from the hospital, he had developed respiratory problems and projectile vomiting. The diagnosis was extremely difficult to make. Total anomalous pulmonary venous drainage with an atrial septal defect, we were told. It occurs once in approximately every 10 million births. The pulmonary veins, which were supposed to bring oxygenated blood back to the heart, were incorrectly routed, entering the heart on the wrong side. If it was as if his heart was turned around backward. Extremely, extremely rare. Heroic open heart surgery could not save Adam, who died several days later. We mourned for months, our hopes and dreams dashed. Our son Jordan was born a year later, a balm for our wounds. At this time of Adam's death, I had been wavering about my earlier choice of psychiatry as a career. I was enjoying my internship in internal medicine, and I had been offered a residency position in medicine. After Adam's death, I firmly decided that I would make psychiatry my profession. I was angry that modern medicine, with all its advanced skills and technology, could not save my son, this simple, tiny baby. My father had been in excellent health until he experienced a massive heart attack early in 1979 at the age of 61. He survived the initial attack, but his heart wall had been irretrievably damaged and he died 3 days later. This was about 9 months before Catherine's first appointment. My father had been a religious man, more ritualistic than spiritual. His Hebrew name, Avram, suited him better than the English Alvin. 4 months after his death, our daughter Amy was born and she was named after him. Here in 1982, in my quiet, darkened office, a deafening cascade of hidden, secret truths were opening upon me. I was swimming in a spiritual sea and I loved the water. My arms were goose flesh. Catherine could not possibly know this information. There was no place even to look it up. My father's Hebrew name, that I had a son who died in infancy from a 1 in 10 million heart defect, my brooding about medicine, my father's death, And my daughter's naming, it was too much, too specific, too true. This unsophisticated laboratory technician was a conduit for transcendental knowledge. If she could reveal these truths, what else was there? I needed to know more. Who? I sputtered. Who is there? Who tells you these things? The masters, she whispered. The master spirits tell me. They tell me I have lived 86 times in physical state. Catherine's breathing slowed and her head stopped rolling from side to side. She was resting. I wanted to go on, but the implications of what she had said was distracting me. Did she really have 86 previous lifetimes? And what about the masters? Could it be? Could our lives be guided by spirits? The message regarding my father and my son opened my mind to possibility of eternity and paranormal phenomena. After this and the subsequent experiences with other patients, my values began to shift toward the spiritual and away from the material, more toward people and relationships and less toward accumulating things. I became more aware of what we take with us and what we don't. Indeed, before these experiences, I did not even believe that a part of us survived physical death. In my travels through Brazil, a spiritually progressed country, I have met many talented and enlightened people. I was very impressed by a medium named Celia. A friend of mine impulsively took me to a group session Celia was conducting in a working class area of Rio de Janeiro. Celia knew nothing about me or my books. She spoke only Portuguese, so my friend translated for me. I was sitting near the front of the auditorium. People had written names on pieces of paper and then put them in a basket. Celia took these pieces, crumpled them, and without looking, called out certain names. People, recognizing the names of their deceased loved ones, approached the small raised podium where Celia was sitting. Sometimes individuals or couples would come up, sometimes entire families. The emotion on their faces reflected in their body language, and it was genuine and spontaneous. More than 800 people from all social classes were in the audience. Nobody knew if or when he or she would be called up. I have rarely seen anyone work as rapidly as Celia. A torrent of exact names, descriptions of physical characteristics, and personality traits all poured forth like a waterfall of facts. Not only she knew how people died, she had access to private and confidential details from the deceased person's life. Details the families found enormously comforting. Her words emerged with a force that belied her small, frail 65 or 70-year-old body. She was shorter than 5 feet tall and she needed an inhaler to keep her asthma in check. Two stories were extraordinarily touching. Celia called out a man's name and his mother, father, and sister came up to the podium. I saw that the family was shaking as Celia vividly described the terrible automobile accident in which the young man had been killed. She told them that he was fine now and sending his love, but that he was not alone. Two other young people had died with him in the car. Celia called out two more names, and in a surreal tableau, the grieving families of the other two victims approached the podium. The father of one of these children stood in back of the others, holding himself stiffly erect and a bit separate, obviously struggling to control his emotions. The others were weeping and holding on to each other. Celia turned to the aloof man's wife. "Do not feel so guilty. They're all well now, in spirit." This woman's son had been the driver of the car, apparently responsible for the accident, and the mother had been feeling particularly terrible. "They send you their love," Celia continued, and she added many more personal details. Then she took a long look at the man who was standing stiffly behind the others. She stood, and even though she was standing on the podium behind a small table, and the others were shakily standing on the floor, her head was still not much higher than the others. She wanted to see him even more clearly. "Your son tells me that you're having a harder time accepting all of this, that it is more difficult for you because you're an engineer." The man nodded at the accuracy of these comments. "He says that you can't stop arguing about the carpet. It is unimportant now." At this comment, the father broke down. Hugging his wife, he began to cry. Unbeknownst of the others, he and his wife had been arguing about a particular carpet in their house for some time. The father insisted the dust of this carpet was responsible for his son's allergies and asthmatic attacks. His wife, however, was convinced her beloved carpet was blameless and refused to part with it. The extremely personal nature of this comment broke through the engineer's intellect and touched his heart. He could no longer deny that he was what he was experiencing. He held his wife tightly as they sobbed together, knowing their son was still alive in spirit, knowing that we are not our bodies and we never really die. After a few other emotional and accurate communications from the other side, Celia called the name of a man who had been shot and murdered 3 weeks previously. The wife of the slain man and his two physician sons walked to the podium. The messages Celia delivered were filled with private details. Then she described the shooting and the medical treatments that followed. She used highly technical medical terms, even wandering into the intricacies of quantum physics. I doubted that Celia had special training in medicine or physics, and my translator confirmed this. As the dead man conveyed his love for his family, the three hugged each other tightly. The healing they were experiencing was palpable throughout the room. Celia was not finished, however. She had a beautiful spiritual message to deliver. "He appreciates your sympathy and your love, but he wants you to also feel sympathy for the man who shot him. Let go of your anger. This man is of a lower level and does not understand spiritual laws. He will pay a heavy price for his action, yet because he is ignorant, he needs help. He needs your prayers. He did not understand, therefore he should not be judged." After 60 or 70 readings, Celia took a break. I was led to a small room with about a dozen other people. Celia was already resting in a chair, and I was introduced to her as a famous doctor from America who wrote and lectured about reincarnation and other spiritual matters. From the questions she asked about my work, it was evident that Celia was not familiar with me or my works. Then she blessed my work, and I praised her abilities. We agreed that only unconditional love really matters. Suddenly, and without any real change in her voice or tone, she started giving me messages. Your son Adam is here, and he wants you to know that his heart is now in the correct position. He watches over and protects his brother Jordan and his sister with the same name as the father. He sends his love to his mother, Carolee. She pronounced the name Carolee. His death was important to bring you peace and serenity later through your work. Carol's father and her uncle, both of whom died many years ago, were the only people who pronounced her name that way. It was their pet name for her. Celia's voice now changed tone a bit and she became more serious. Your spiritual work is exactly right. It is correct and good. Don't get discouraged. Continue. The work is helping everywhere. Even on the other side, it will grow even larger. As Celia's words entered my mind and my heart, I remembered Catherine's message 17 years earlier. Moving and life changing messages from my father and my son Adam. A chill came over me, these 17 years later. I knew that Celia knew nothing about me or my family and that she had not read my books. Her accuracy gave me goosebumps. After all these years, I still don't take miracles for granted. Celia did not know that I do get discouraged from time to time because the demands of the work keep me from family and friends, because I cannot possibly respond to the many requests for help, and because of the relentless onslaught from skeptics and critics. Celia's word revived my heart and refreshed my soul. The 800 people and I were sharing a remarkable experience. As I returned to the larger room, I felt the peaceful, loving energy that filled the building. I talked briefly to the 4 families whose messages I described above. None had ever met or talked to Celia or her staff before the moment they were called. The next morning, I phoned my friend to thank him for taking me to Celia. He said that he had spoken to Celia after I had left, and she had told him that many more spirits were there for me when I was in the room with her. Many were trying to come through with the messages for me, but she did not want to overload or overwhelm me. So she stopped with Adam's message. A brief wave of disappointment washed over me. I wanted to hear and experience much more. But I was happy with that what I had observed and heard throughout that day, and my discouragement faded. A few years earlier, James Van Praagh, the American medium and author of the international bestseller Talking to Heaven and Now Reaching to Heaven, had predicted that my work would be reaching larger and larger audiences. He told me that I was in a transition period to an even higher level of influence in the world, which desperately needed a spiritual direction and a melding of science and spirituality. My mind heard these predictions, but I really didn't believe them. There just seemed to be too much opposition and skepticism in the way. For 9 years, I had been exhausting myself trying to teach about the truth and reality of life after death, reincarnation, and divine love. For 9 years, I had been ridiculed and mocked for teaching that love never stops, that we and our loved ones do not die when our bodies die, that we continue to exist and continue to love as spirits, and if necessary, back here in physical state. I knew I was teaching the truth, but so many people keep their minds closed. How could the work reach a higher level, and why now? During and shortly after the Brazil trip, three things happened that in sequence began to awaken me and to alert me to the possibility that Celia and James were correct. The first was the size of the crowds and the media reaction to my talks and workshops in Brazil. In every city I visited, thousands of people poured into the auditorium. Every event was sold out. Television, newspapers, and magazines covered all events. Book signing would go on for hours because of the huge number of people waiting patiently in the long lines. Yet my mind managed to discount this huge reaction. This is Brazil. I rationalized Brazil is a country of immense spiritual awareness and enlightenment, a land of spectacular physical beauty, but especially of beautiful people. The people are open minded, loving, and already spiritually awakened. Spiritists such as Allan Kardec had already paved the way. Brazil is an exception, I thought, as are many of the other countries of Latin America, where people feel free to talk about and share their spiritual experiences. Then the second event occurred. Over the years, I have treated many celebrities, political leaders, sports stars, and others in my practice. Because of the rules of confidentiality and respect for their privacy, I cannot talk or write about them. They, of course, are not bound by the same restrictions. Yet, because of their concern about public reaction, it is very rare for someone of their prominence to talk about me, my books, or our work together. One exception has been Gloria Estefan, an incredibly talented singer and actress who is also a person of enormous physical and moral courage. She is very advanced spiritually. Gloria has a beautiful heart and has helped the Miami community in numerous charitable ways. So when she went public about me, I was thrilled but not surprised. In a magazine article in June 1996, Gloria said, I have meditated my whole life almost as a form of self hypnosis, but I didn't really know what it was until after my tour bus accident, when a friend of mine sent me the book Many Lives, Many Masters by Brian Weiss. It made a big impact on me and gave me a lot of strength during my recovery. I drew upon it often. I was always curious about hypnosis without realizing that I had been doing a form of it myself for years. Eventually, I met Brian Weiss and he hypnotized me. He used the same method that I have been using since I was a child to do a kind of inner meditation. That has been my way of praying as well. But Gloria was not the second event. Sylvester Stallone was. While I was in Brazil in August of 1997, he told the American press about how I helped him prepare for his role in Copland, his new movie. Critics were praising Stallone's acting in Copland. He was not playing an action hero again, but a much more dramatically demanding role as a physically impaired sheriff fighting corruption in a small town. The newspapers wrote Stallone underwent internal preparation as well, especially knowing he would be working opposite Robert De Niro, Harvey Keitel, and Ray Liotta. I had never worked with such good actors before, he says, confessing some trepidation. And suddenly I was thrown into this arena that was like going from the Cub Scouts to the Green Berets. One of the things that he did was to consult Dr. Brian Weiss, author of the best selling Many Lives, Many Masters. Weiss, a Miami psychiatrist who mixes hypnosis, spiritual psychotherapy, and past life regression into his practice, helps Stallone tap into something he had forgotten. Weiss came upon the idea of non physical courage, which is the bravest of all. A man who enters a situation knowing there is no chance he can physically survive the outcome, but he willingly does it for an ideal. Weiss says his meeting with Stallone wasn't about unearthing any past lives. It wasn't a doctor patient thing. This character of a hero of a deeper moral and spiritual courage, and he was concerned about being able to express that. My impression was that Stallone has these qualities innately. All I did was help him remove any possible obstacles to his expression of these qualities. Such extensive preparation for a movie was something Stallone hadn't done in for a long time. Not because he hadn't wanted to, but because the roles he was taking didn't require much more from him other than to show up, dodge bullets, and hang from an occasional mountain. The fact that Sylvester Stallone had the courage to mention me publicly meant that millions more people became aware of the work. The third event happened only a few days after Sylvester Stallone's quote and Celia's messages. This event had a great impact on me personally, but it was much more private. I had returned to Miami from Brazil on August 19, 1997. On August 22nd, I received a phone call in my office. The phone call was from the Kensington Palace in London, the home of Diana, Princess of Wales. Princess Diana's personal assistant, Jacqueline Allen, was on the line. The princess loved your book, Only Love is Real, Jacqueline told me. It brought her great comfort and peace. She would like to talk with you. Are you planning a trip to England in the near future? No, I answered. There is nothing scheduled, but I'm sure we can arrange something. Well, she is on holiday right now. She would like to contact you when she returns to England. That would be my pleasure, I responded. I'm going to send her my other books and some audio tapes. We sent her a package of books and tapes that afternoon, and I looked forward to her call. I had admired her courage, her compassion, and her charitable work, and the way she seemed able to show great love to people with AIDS and other afflictions. Of course, Princess Diana never did call me. On August 31st, just before she was to return to England, fired were killed in that terrible automobile crash in a tunnel in Paris. I do not believe in coincidences, and I'm writing this section about Princess Diana now only a few days after her death. I'm deeply saddened, although I know she is fine, that her loving and shining soul is alive and well and clothed in light and in love on the other side. Still, there is always a sorrow when people leave us physically. I believe there are two reasons why I heard from Kensington Palace the week before Diana's death. Only Love is Real is a book about soulmates and about love. It is about people who have that special connection that transcends time and space. It is about people who have been together before in past lifetimes or across spiritual dimensions and who find their loved ones again in this life. They learn and love, they learn that love is eternal and absolute. Love never ends, not even by death. We are always loved. We are never alone. We are always reunited with our loved ones. I believe that Princess Diana felt a soulmate connection to Dodi Fayed and probably to her sons and to other loved ones as well. Perhaps only Love is Real helped her to understand these powerful connections. The other reason is that people often have premonitions or strong intuitive feelings about important events in their lives. Frequently, these feelings are about impending deaths, whether theirs or of other people close to them. There are so many accounts of people saying goodbye in one way or another just before their unexpected death. One of my patients, the young pregnant wife of a businessman killed in an airplane crash in Colombia, had recurrent dream of his death in a plane crash for the entire month before it happened. How could she have been warned in advance if this were truly a random accident? Another patient was a woman in Miami whose brother was killed in a car accident in Michigan. Weeks before the accident, she had visited funeral homes to get more information. Perhaps Diana knew at some level. Only Love is Real, just like Many Lives, Many Masters and Through Time into Healing, is not only about soulmates and past lives. It is about truth and divine love. It explains that there really is no death, only life, that our souls are eternal and can never be harmed, and we will always meet our loved ones again, in spirit and in body. These are books of hope, not just because they are comforting, but because they are true. Perhaps the book comforted Princess Diana about the earlier death of her beloved father. Was she still grieving for him? Was her comfort and peace related to him? Princess Diana read my book just before her death. The timing is not a coincidence. She learned more about soulmates, but she also learned more about souls. I'm sure her reception on the other side was resplendent with brilliant light, loving greetings, and incredible joy. I miss her. I hope my book was able to help her a little bit. The small conference room was packed with 150 hanging on his every word as I witnessed the spiritual medium, James Van Praagh, convey information from deceased loved ones. Even the skeptics among us has to marvel at the small evidential details he delivered to those hungry for proof that their loved ones lived on. Those he addressed acknowledged his accuracy. The more intimate the detail, the more astonished and the more touched we all were. Carol and I were sitting about halfway back in audience. I was having trouble intellectually understanding how James could know all these small facts. They tell me is always his simple answer. On my left sat a woman who looked to be in her mid-30s. James called out a man's name, and an older woman on the other side of her shakily rose from her chair. "That's my mother," the younger woman confided to me. A stream of confirming details, which some call evidentials, flew from James to the other older woman who was in her 60s. Yes, yes, oh yes, she kept replying. Her hands were tensed into tight balls, her legs were unsteady. He thanks you for tending to his roses, James went on. He knows you do this because of your love for him, and he returns love to you. The older woman nodded, tears falling from her eyes. And don't worry about the dogs, James said enigmatically with a touch of humor. Her daughter turned to me to explain. She does tend to my father's rose garden. She seems driven to do so. And she worries so about our dogs running through and ruining the garden. This is so amazing. Her eyes were also welling with tears. I was so touched by what was happening that I had to struggle to maintain some objectivity and distance. He thanks you for bringing something of his here today. James paused for a moment. It's a ring. He's telling me it's his ring. You have brought it today with you to help his chances of coming through. As James finished, the woman slowly stretched out her arm in front of her and opened her left hand, which throughout the reading had been tightly clenched. In her hand was her husband's ring, which even I, 2 seats away, had not noticed until that moment. All in the room were deeply moved. A glowing smile spread across the older woman's face. She knew her husband was there communicating with her. She never carries that ring, her daughter answered to my inquiring look. She only brought it to this conference hoping that it would help. I guess it did, she added, tears rolling gently down her cheeks. Mediums are not mind readers. In Fort Lauderdale, Florida, James was once again directed to specific people in the audience. I had just observed him helping a grieving couple whose 7-year-old daughter had recently died of leukemia. She sends her love and is very grateful to you for keeping her with all the toys and dolls and unicorns. Although this made no sense at that moment to me, the young parents reacted immediately. With great emotion, they explained that their daughter had been cremated. The box with her ashes was kept in her bedroom among the young girl's dolls and toys. The bed sheets and pillowcases were their daughter's favorite ones, decorated with unicorns. James had never met or talked with these young parents before that moment. Neither did he realize that the next person to whom he was directed was a young woman whom I knew. James had just arrived from California, where he lives, and not met her before. I have David here. David, somebody's son, who has died and is in spirit. A few women stood up, as David is not a rare name, but the young woman I know did not stand. She has no children. Her husband's brother, whose name was David, had died suddenly 2 years previously. But thus far the information was not specific enough for her to respond. James did not seem to connect with any of the women who had responded. Who is the pilot? James then asked. He's telling me about a pilot, someone with David who is a pilot. Now the woman who was standing sat down, but the young woman shakily stood. I have David. He is my brother-in-law, my husband's brother. And he died 2 years ago. His mother is a pilot. She flies airplanes. Now James seemed satisfied with the proper connection that had been made. He wants to give his love to her, James added. Then he looked up and to the side as if he were listening to someone. Then he looked back to the young woman. He looked up above her head. I see a red knife over your head. I'm being shown that somebody has been looking at this knife and thinking about cleaning the knife. The young woman knew nothing about a red knife. Neither she nor her husband owned it. She could not confirm this information. Keep it, James added, meaning to remember this for the future. Then he moved on to the next stranger because everyone in the ballroom was new to him. A few days later, I talked to the young woman. You won't believe this, she told me. When she returned home after the workshop concluded, she had called her mother in law, who lives in rural Pennsylvania. She did not tell her mother in law, David's mother, about the workshop or about James. She merely asked one question. Does a red knife mean anything to you? It's funny you should ask that. Yesterday, I was down in the basement cleaning up and moving some fishing equipment. I saw David's old Swiss Army knife and I picked it up. I remember thinking I really should clean this knife. James had become aware of a thought in the mind of David's mother, who had picked up the red knife and experienced the thought about cleaning it the day before the workshop. The young man in the audience had no knowledge of this knife or of the thought, which occurred in the basement of a house more than 1,000 miles distant. The details of Swiss Army knives, pilots, unicorns, and so on are much too specific to be relegated to the categories of coincidence or generality. We all learn to do what James does, as you will see throughout this book, but we lack the confidence and the practice to realize this. I like to use the analogy of playing the piano when I talk about learning to use our psychic abilities. Not everyone is born with the talent to be a virtuoso pianist. However, with lessons and with practice and hard work, all of us can learn to bang out a few tunes. The same is true with developing our intuitive process. Friends, with this we come to the end of the book reading session. It's been a longer reading session because I really didn't want to lose the pace. It's been interesting. And I'll catch up again tomorrow around 7 to continue with Messages from the Masters by Dr. Brian Weiss. Till that time, take care. This is Vibha Nashin signing off.